Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study. New day, new Bible study today, 1 Kings chapter 4. There's a free PDF on our website if you want to go out there and download it. There's a button, click download PDF, and there you go, it's all yours. This chapter is a little bit more manageable in size and in content than the last three chapters. These have been hefty. They've been hard to fit on the PDF outline, but today a little bit better. Let's talk about when these events took place. 1 Kings chapter 4 discusses events that took place in the early to middle years of King Solomon as his reign is maturing. Solomon was king for 40 years in total, according to 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42. Based on the timeline that we're using, that would be approximately 1015 to 975 BC. As far as our key historical characters, we've got Solomon, who's the third king of all Israel and Judah, and we've also got Solomon's officials. These were men who helped Solomon govern the nation in various capacities. Some of them will be new, but some of the names you're going to recognize. Now today we have our expanded map that zooms out a little bit from just the Promised Land and the area of the 12 tribes. You'll probably know where the capital of Israel and Judah was. That was in Jerusalem, right? We've been talking about that. Now, we are going to talk about the expanded map in some places way to the north and way to the south of that Promised Land. This was the territory that Solomon reigned over. So he reigned from the Euphrates River, which is hundreds of miles north of Jerusalem, down to the southwest to the border of Egypt. That is page number 1. Now let's move over to page number 2 to our outline section. Just 2 sections under the outline today. The first one, verses 1 through 19, Solomon's officials. So the first part of the chapter lists Israel and Judah's religious and civil officials. We saw something similar during the reign of David, but here we have it again now that Solomon is on the throne. And I'll just read these for you. And again, you're going to recognize some of these names from Solomon's early life and even into David's reign. Zadok, Abiathar, and Azariah. This was Azariah, who's the son of Zadok. They were the priests. Elihoreph and Ahijah were secretaries. The KJV says that they were scribes. Jehoshaphat was the recorder. Benaiah, who, you remember his old job? He used to be in charge of David's bodyguard, but now he's the commander of the army. Azariah, this is a different Azariah. This is the son of Nathan. He was over the officers. Zabud was priest and king's friend. The KJV has that as principal officer. And Ahishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram managed the forced labor. Now, in addition to these guys, Solomon also appointed 12 officers to manage the food and the provisions for his house and his court. Each of these officers was in charge of providing food for 1 month out of the year. And verses 8 through 19 record the names of these individuals and the regions that they oversaw. Now, I have to say that section number 2 is maybe a little bit more interesting to read to think about. Wisdom and wealth is what I've titled the section, verses 20 through 34. The text says this as it opens this section. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. And I have a reference there to Genesis chapter 22, verse 17. And I think this language is intentional, that the nation, the people in this nation, the nation that descended from Abraham, they were as many as the sands of the sea, or sand by the sea. Now that's the exact promise that God made to Abraham hundreds of years before this, that he was going to make his descendants a great nation. They're going to be like the stars in the sky, the sand by the sea. So here we see kind of the fulfillment, at least in part, of the promises that God made to Abraham hundreds of years earlier. Solomon ruled, as we mentioned, from the Euphrates River down to the border of Egypt. And every day, Solomon's court, it was so large that it required this quantity of food. First, 30 cores of flour. They think that a core was approximately 220 liters. So that would work out to be about 6,600 liters, or 1,746 gallons of fine flour every day. But it wasn't just fine flour that he used. He also used 60 cores of meal. And that would be about 13,200 liters, or 3,592 gallons. For meat, they slaughtered 10 fat oxen, 20 cattle, 100 sheep, deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened birds. And so Solomon had quite a court. And I think this is really to tell us about the prosperity of the nation. That chicken is going to be in my list of things to slaughter today. I sound like a psychopath, but So we see here the prosperity of Solomon, his court, the people who were around him, and this was God's blessing on their nation, which we'll talk about in the application section. Israel and Judah had peace from all of their surrounding enemies, which was another fulfillment of one of God's promises. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen, which is a huge number. Now that's a little bit about Solomon's prosperity and wealth and the nation of Israel's wealth. Now we talk about Solomon's wisdom. God made Solomon wiser than any man on earth. He was so wise that he actually became famous in the nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. So if you read the book of Proverbs, many of those are Solomon's proverbs, right? And so that's the record. Now, chronologically, Proverbs is much of it is being written during the life of Solomon, but we won't get to that book until quite a bit later. So remember, not all of the Old Testament is in chronological order. Solomon had knowledge of trees, birds, reptiles, fish, and other animals. So it makes you wonder if God gave him not only wisdom, but also kind of knowledge, factual knowledge to accompany that. As his fame spread, people from the other nations traveled to Jerusalem to meet him. So he was so famous that people were like, I got to go hear this guy. And so they would travel to Israel to meet up with him, to hear him, to be taught by him maybe. Now it's time for our application as we finish up today. The prosperity and the success of Solomon's kingdom really is the goal of every nation. And the Bible tells us this about national success. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. So in 1 Kings chapter 4, we see the bloom of a nation that was cultivated by God, blessed by him for their obedience to him, particularly for David's obedience to the Lord. This picture of flourishing Israel is a foretaste of the happiness and the peace that we will get to experience in the kingdom of God if we are God's people, God's children. We generally refer to that as heaven. Solomon was reigning as king. All of his enemies were put down. There was this time of peace. Well, when Jesus returns, puts down all the enemies that are against him and reigns as king over God's saints, we are going to be blessed to live in an even better kingdom with an even better king.